moment my father pointed at me in front of a room full of people and said, "She has never accomplished a single thing in her life." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked at him and thought, "You have no idea what you're sitting on top of." But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Cassidy. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house that smelled like my mother's lavender candles and my father's ambition, which, if you've never encountered it, smells a lot like whiskey and disappointment that got redirected outward. My father built a mid-size commercial real estate development firm from nothing in the 90s, and he never once let any of us forget it. Every dinner, every holiday, every phone call that lasted longer than 3 minutes somehow circled back to what he'd built, what he'd sacrificed, and what the rest of us owed him for the life we got to have because of it. I have an older brother. I'll call him my brother, because that's what he is, even if that word has felt hollow for years now. He's 4 years older than me, went to Ohio State on our father's dime, got an MBA, and walked directly into a senior position at my father's firm before he'd even finished unpacking his apartment. My father groomed him for it. Everyone knew it. My brother knew it. I knew it. The difference is, my brother thought it was his birthright and I thought it was a setup. I was not the favorite. That was never a secret in our house. My mother used to say I was too independent, which was her gentle way of saying my father found me difficult. I asked too many questions. I didn't defer. When he said something at the dinner table, I would sometimes, not always, just sometimes, push back. Just a little. Just enough to say, "I'm thinking about this," not just accepting it. That was enough. That was the whole crime. I left for Chicago at 22 with a finance degree from a school my father calls perfectly fine. I had $4,000 in savings, a studio apartment I found on Craigslist in Pilsen, and a job offer at a small private equity firm that nobody outside of Chicago had ever heard of. My father called it playing pretend. My brother at the time was being groomed to take over the Columbus operation. We were already living in different worlds. For a while, I didn't tell my family much about what I was doing, not because I was hiding anything. I just knew they weren't that interested. I'd call my mother on Sundays and she'd ask if I was eating enough and whether I'd met anyone nice. She never once asked about work. My father and I talked maybe 4 times in those first 2 years, and every conversation had the texture of a job performance review I hadn't asked for. Was I saving enough? Did I have a real career path? Did I understand that my choices had a ceiling? What I was actually doing, learning everything I could about distressed commercial assets. My firm specialized in identifying undervalued commercial properties. The kind that looked like liabilities on paper but had hidden leverage if you understood the zoning laws, the tax structures, the way financing terms could be restructured. I was good at it. Better than good. I had a brain for the kind of math that looks like chaos until it suddenly doesn't. My boss, a 50-something woman named Judith who wore reading glasses on a chain and had no patience for excuses, told me after my first year that I had better instincts than people twice my age. I held on to that. I needed it. By 26, I had started making meaningful equity, not family dinner conversation money. Real money. The kind that changes your options. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling this story to brag. I'm telling it because what came later only makes sense if you understand that I have been building something in silence for years, and the people who were supposed to know me best had no idea. Not because I hid it from them. Because they never asked. Around the time I turned 28, my father's firm started having trouble. I heard about it in pieces. First through my mother, who mentioned offhand that things were stressful at the office. Then through my brother, who called me one evening sounding tighter than usual and asked, a little too casually, whether I'd ever considered coming back to Columbus. I said I hadn't. He said it might be worth thinking about. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it. What I learned, through some careful listening and a few discreet conversations with people who still worked in the Columbus market, was this. My father had over-leveraged on 3 development projects at once, all of them stalled by permitting delays and construction cost overruns. He owed money to a regional bank, a private lender, and 2 contractor groups. The firm wasn't going under immediately, but it was bleeding, and the more he bled, the more he needed an influx of capital. He never called me to tell me any of this. He called my brother every day. He called his golf partners. He called his lawyer. He did not call me. So when the call finally came, I knew what it was before he said a word. He needed a private loan. $250,000. He said it was temporary. He said the projects were solid, just delayed. He said he would put up personal collateral, the equity in the office building on Morse Road that served as the firm's headquarters. He had owned that building outright for 12 years. It was worth considerably more than what he was asking for. What he did not know when he called me was that I had already spent 6 weeks quietly reviewing the firm's financials through some publicly available filings and a few well-placed questions. I knew the building's current appraisal. I knew the existing liens. I knew what the firm's real exposure was. I also had a very good attorney. I said yes to the loan. But I did it properly. I insisted on formalizing it. A promissory note, a recorded security interest in the Morse Road property as collateral, structured as a senior secured loan with a specific repayment schedule and default provisions. My father pushed back on the paperwork. He said it felt transactional for family. I said I had a financial obligation to document loans regardless of who they were to. My attorney sent the documents. My father signed them. My brother called me the day after the signing and said, "You know, he was uncomfortable with all that legal language." I said I understood. My brother said, "You didn't have to make it such a big deal." I said I was protecting both of us. I transferred the money. For 8 months, payments came on time. I checked every statement. Everything looked fine. Then, in the 9th month, the payment didn't come. I called my father. He said there had been a processing delay and it would come next week. It came 3 weeks late. The month after that, it didn't come at all. I sent a formal notice of default through my attorney, because that's what the agreement required. My father called me personally furious and told me I was treating him like a stranger. I said, "I'm treating you like a borrower, because that's the arrangement you agreed to." That was apparently the moment things shifted. Not in the loan, but in how my family started talking about me. Over the following months, I learned through my mother that my father had been telling people, family friends, business associates, anyone who would listen, that I had entrapped him with predatory loan terms, that I had always had it out for him, that I had never really cared about the family, only about using them. My brother echoed most of this. He told me in one call that I had been calculating from the beginning, and that the loan was never about helping the family, it was about leverage. I want to be precise about how this felt. It didn't feel like betrayal exactly. It felt like the confirmation of something I had already suspected for a long time. That my success was only welcome in my family as long as it stayed invisible, as long as it served them without making any demands in return. The default became official. My attorney filed the appropriate notices. My father's attorney fired back with a lawsuit, claiming the loan terms were unconscionable and that I had exploited a position of undue influence over a family member in financial distress. They were, in effect, suing me for enforcing the contract he had signed. The case was assigned to a courtroom in Franklin County. My father hired an attorney named Warren, a man I had met once at a 4th of July party who had the energy of someone who had been confidently wrong his entire life. Warren was apparently well regarded in local real estate litigation. He was not, however, familiar with what I had been doing for the past 9 years. Neither, it turned out, was my father. Not really. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my attorney, Diane, beside me, our documents organized, our arguments structured. My father arrived with my brother flanking him on one side and Warren on the other. He looked at me the way he had looked at me my entire life, like I was a problem that had refused to stay small. The hearing opened with Warren presenting their case. The argument, such as it was, centered on 3 claims: that the loan terms were coercive, that my father had signed under duress because of his emotional relationship with me, and that I had structured the security interest specifically to give myself an unfair advantage in the event of default. Then Warren did something I had not entirely anticipated, though I should have. He called my father to speak. Warren had apparently coached him to be measured and sympathetic. That lasted approximately 45 seconds. Once my father started talking about me, the coaching dissolved. He said I had always resented the family's success. He said I had used my so-called finance career, and he actually used air quotes when he said it, to create a trap. He said I was, and I am quoting him exactly here, the kind of person who turns everything into a transaction because she has never understood what it means to be part of a family. Then he looked directly at me and said, "She has never accomplished a single thing that wasn't handed to her or taken from someone else." The room went quiet. My attorney put her hand on my arm briefly. I didn't move. The judge. Her name was Judge Patricia Norris, and she had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible human dispute and was still paying full attention. Looked at my father for a moment over the top of her glasses. Then she looked at the court record. Then she looked at Warren. "Counselor," she said, "I'd like to give the respondent's attorney an opportunity to speak before we continue." Diane stood up. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She walked the judge through the loan documents, the promissory note, the recorded UCC-1 filing establishing the senior security interest, the payment history, the default notices, and the full timeline. She explained clearly and without drama that my father had been represented by his own attorney at the time of signing, that the terms were standard for a privately structured secured loan, and that there was no credible legal basis for a claim of undue influence when both parties had independent legal counsel. Then Diane did something that I had discussed with her at length, but had never been entirely sure was the right move until I watched it happen. She submitted my professional biography into the record. Not a resume. A biography. The kind that gets written about you when you've spent 9 years doing work that other people in your industry pay attention to. Senior associate at a Chicago-based PE firm at 25. Lead analyst on a $40 million distressed asset acquisition at 27. Named to a regional business journal's 40 under 40 list at 29. Currently a managing director at her firm, overseeing a portfolio valued at just over $200 million. Diane set the document on the judge's bench and said simply, "The respondent is not a relative who stumbled into a complicated financial arrangement. She is a credentialed professional who structured a legally sound loan in good faith, fulfilled her obligations, and is now defending her rights under a binding agreement." Judge Norris read the document. She read it slowly. Then she looked up at my father. "Mr. she said his name. "You've described your daughter as someone who has never accomplished anything of significance." She paused. "Are you familiar with her professional background?" My father blinked. "She works at some company in Chicago." "Some company," Judge Norris repeated. She looked back at the document. Then she looked at Warren. "Counselor, you filed this claim alleging that your client was at a disadvantage in this transaction due to the respondent's, and I'm quoting your filing here, limited financial sophistication relative to the lender. Is that still your position?" Warren opened his mouth, closed it. "We believe the emotional dynamic of the family relationship." "I asked about the financial sophistication argument," Judge Norris said. Warren said something about context. The judge moved on. What followed was a methodical, 40-minute evisceration of every argument my father's attorney had presented. The claim of coercion failed because my father had his own counsel. The claim of undue influence failed because there was no evidence of pressure and plenty of evidence of a fair and documented process. The claim that the security interest was structured unfairly failed because senior secured lending is a standard financing structure that any competent attorney could have advised against, and my father's attorney had presumably reviewed the terms before signing. Judge Norris ruled that the loan was valid and enforceable. She ruled that the default was legitimate. She ruled that I had the right to proceed with collection against the Morse Road property as the documented collateral. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "I want to note for the record that this court finds no merit whatsoever in the characterization of the respondent as a financially unsophisticated party or as someone who acted in bad faith. The documentation presented today reflects the work of someone who understood this transaction clearly and protected both parties by formalizing it properly. If anything, the formalization of this loan appears to have been an act of diligence, not aggression. Then she adjourned. My brother left without looking at me. Warren gathered his papers with the energy of a man who needed to make several phone calls before he could process what had happened. My father stood at his table for a moment longer than everyone else. I saw him glance at Diane's copy of my biography, still on the table. I don't know what he read in it in that moment. I don't know if any of it landed. Outside the courthouse, Diane said, "That went as well as it possibly could." I said yes. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine and I meant it. But I also stood on the courthouse steps for a few minutes after she walked away and just breathed the cold November air and tried to figure out what I was actually feeling. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It was something quieter than that. The Morse Road property was appraised and the lien was enforced. After attorney's fees and costs, the recovery came close to covering the outstanding principal and interest. My father's firm restructured. My brother took over operations. I don't know the details of what came after, because by then I had stopped monitoring it. My mother called me about 3 weeks after the hearing. She said she wasn't calling to take sides. She said she thought everyone had handled things badly. I didn't argue with that. She said my father was struggling, that he had never expected things to end up the way they did, that he was having a hard time. I said I understood that, and I did. She asked if I thought we could repair things eventually. I said I hoped so, but that I wasn't willing to pretend that what he'd said about me in that courtroom hadn't happened. She said, he was under a lot of pressure. I said, I know, so was I. For years. We didn't talk for another month after that. When we did, we started smaller. We talked about normal things. She told me her book club had picked something she actually liked for once. I told her I'd finally gotten a good couch for my apartment. It was slow. It was careful. I think it might be the most honest our relationship has ever been, because we were both working at it instead of pretending the old version of it was fine. My father and I have not spoken since the hearing. I don't know if we will. I've thought about what I would want to say to him if we did, and the honest answer is that I don't have a speech prepared. I don't have a list of grievances I need him to acknowledge. What I think I want, if I want anything from him, is just for him to see me clearly for once. Not the version of me he decided on when I was 17. Not the problem daughter. Not the calculating one. Just me. What I actually built. Who I actually am. He might never get there. I've made a kind of peace with that. What I know is this. I spent the better part of a decade building something real. Quietly in a city where no one from my family could see it. And when the moment came, when I was sitting in a Franklin County courtroom while my father told a judge I'd never accomplished anything, the record spoke for itself. I didn't have to say a word. I've thought a lot about what my father actually lost that day in the Franklin County courthouse. Not the building on Morse Road. Not the money. Those were just assets. What he lost was the story he'd been telling himself for 31 years. That I was the difficult one. The one who never quite measured up. The one whose choices had a ceiling. The thing about that kind of story is that it requires the other person to stay small enough to fit inside it. And I had quietly, without announcement, stopped fitting a long time ago. What I keep coming back to is this. My father is not a stupid man. He built something real in the 90s. He understood leverage and risk and timing when it suited him, but somewhere along the way, his certainty about who I was became more important to him than the evidence in front of him. He signed a loan document prepared by a managing director with a 9-year track record in private equity and thought he was borrowing money from his daughter who worked at some company in Chicago. Those are not the same thing. He chose not to know the difference, and that choice, made over and over in small ways and large ones, is what ultimately walked him into that courtroom without the information he needed. That's not fate. That's not punishment from some outside force. That's just what happens when you stop paying attention to the people in your life. because you've already decided who they are. I think about Diane standing up at that plaintiff's table, calm and unhurried, laying out the documentation. I think about Judge Norris reading my biography and then looking up at my father over her glasses. And I think about the fact that none of that would have meant anything if I hadn't spent years doing the actual work. Not to prove something to him. Not for that moment in court, but because the work itself mattered to me. The discipline of it. The integrity of it. Structuring that loan properly, insisting on documentation even when my father called it transactional. Protecting both of us even when he resented the protection. Those weren't strategic moves. They were just the right things to do, and they happened to be exactly what the record needed when the record needed to speak. That's the part I want to hold on to. Not the outcome, but the process that made it possible. The years of showing up when nobody in my family was watching. The choice to do things correctly even when it would have been easier and less uncomfortable not to. The refusal to let someone else's diminished version of me become the version I lived inside. My father may never see me clearly. I've made a kind of peace with that, though I won't pretend it doesn't cost anything. What I know is that I don't need his acknowledgement to understand my own value. I didn't build what I built because he believed in me. I built it because I did. And in the end, the record spoke for itself. I didn't have to say a single word.